The city of Lake Haven didn't so much welcome the new prosecutor as it absorbed him, like a sponge soaking up a drop of clean water. He arrived on a Tuesday, under a sky the color of dirty dishwater. The air was thick with the smell of wet pavement and distant industry. He was a man built for courtrooms, not for charm. He stood straight, his suits were expensive but quiet, and his eyes missed very little. He had been brought in from the state capital, a place of policy and procedure, to a city where the rules had a habit of bending. His task, though no one said it so plainly, was to look at the narcotics unit of the Lake Haven Police Department. Rumors had been flowing upstream from months' whispers of missing evidence, of cash that never made it to the property room, of suspects who walked away too easily after a quiet conversation. He took a small, neat apartment with a view of the river. His only real personal luxury was his car. It wasn't just a car. It was an Aston Martin Valkyrie, a symphony of carbon fiber and polished aluminum. It looked less like a vehicle and more like a piece of future that had accidentally fallen into the present. It was the one flashy thing about him, a reward for years of meticulous work. He understood its mechanics, its precision. It responded perfectly to the lightest touch, a machine that operated purely on logic and excellence. He liked that the car caused a stir the first day he parked it outside the district attorney's office. It gleamed under the gray sky, an alien artifact. From the fourth-floor window of the police precinct across the street, a pair of eyes watched it. Those eyes belonged to a detective. He'd been in Lake Haven for 22 years. He knew its rhythms, its shortcuts, its secrets. He had a face that had seen too much, and a body that was running to softness around the edges from too many late-night diner meals and not enough sleep. He was a good cop by his own definition. He got results. He put bad guys away. So what if the path to putting them away sometimes got a little messy? The city was a jungle, and you couldn't fight in a jungle with a rulebook. He believed in a system, too, but his system was based on respect, on fear, on traded favors. He knew which shop owners would look the other way, which informants would sing for a dropped charge, which sergeants would approve an overtime slip without asking questions. The precinct was his castle. The new prosecutor, in his ridiculous spaceship of a car, was an invader. "Look at that," the detective grunted to his younger partner, nodding out the window. "Must be nice to play with toys like that while the rest of us dig in the dirt." The partner, newer and more cautious, just shrugged. "He's from the AG's office." "Here he's sharp." "Sharp," the detective echoed, the word tasting sour. "I'll tell you what's sharp. His suit, his hair, that car. Guys like that, they use the law like a scalpel. We're out here using a hammer. Sometimes you need a hammer." The prosecutor spent his first week learning the landscape. He reviewed case files, met the assistants, studied the chain of custody logs for the narcotics unit. He saw pattern small things. A time discrepancy here. An evidence bag initialed by an officer who was on vacation that day. A large cash seizure where the paperwork was suspiciously perfect, unlike the messy, coffee-stained forms from a simpler arrest. He didn't jump to conclusions. He collected facts, just like he always did. The detective, meanwhile, was finalizing what he called a career maker. A 6-month investigation into a mid-level dealer operating out of the old shipyards. It was good, solid police work. He had a confidential informant, surveillance photos, a taped phone call. It was clean. It was his. He brought the warrant request to the DA's office, confident, already thinking about the commendation. It landed on the new prosecutor's desk. The prosecutor read it, then reread it. His eyes, those detail-catching eyes, saw it. The affidavit for the warrant relied heavily on the word of the confidential informant. The informant had a long history. And there, in the footnotes of his record, was a recent dismissal of a possession charge, a dismissal signed by a judge the detective played golf with. A favor called in. It wasn't illegal, but it was contaminated. It showed bias. It showed the informant might be saying what he needed to say to stay out of trouble. The prosecutor couldn't approve it. The law was a structure, and if you built it on a weak foundation, the whole thing would collapse in court. He sent it back with a concise, polite note. Insufficient demonstration of CI reliability. Request denied without prejudice. Resubmit with corroborating independent evidence. The detective got the message while he was at his desk, surrounded by the clutter of his career-framed photos of arrests. A chipped coffee mug, a stack of case files. He read the note. His face, already ruddy, darkened to a deep purple. He felt a heat rise in his chest. His case. His arrest. Denied by some paper pusher who'd been in town for 5 minutes. The younger partner saw the storm brewing and found a reason to be elsewhere. He's trying to make a point, the detective muttered to the empty air. Trying to show who's boss. He crumpled the note and threw it, perfectly, into the trash can. The humiliation burned. He'd have to tell the lieutenant. He'd have to tell the guys on the task force. They'd been watching, waiting to see if the new suit would play ball. Now they knew. He wasn't here to play. He was here to tear up the field. That night, the detective didn't go home. He went to the last call, a bar a few blocks from the precinct that was popular with off-duty cops and nobody else. He sat on the same stool he always used and drank bourbon neat. Each glass poured fuel on the fire of his anger. He talked to a few other guys, his voice loud and bitter. Kid comes in with his rich boy car, he slurred to a sympathetic desk sergeant, and thinks he can shut down real police work. On a technicality. A damn technicality. He left the bar late, the world blurry at the edges. The cool night air did nothing to clear his head. He walked, his steps heavy, back toward the precinct to get his own car from the lot. And that's when he saw it. There it was, parked under a streetlight outside a brightly lit all-night diner. The Valkyrie. It looked almost unreal, its silver paint glowing, its low shape seeming to crouch on the asphalt. It was empty. The prosecutor was probably inside, getting a coffee, studying more files, ruining more lives from a diner booth. The detective stopped and stared. The car seemed to mock him. It was everything he wasn't: clean, sophisticated, untouched by the grime of the city. It was the physical symbol of the man who had just embarrassed him, who threatened his world. A dangerous, stupid idea, born of bourbon and fury, began to form in his foggy mind. It wasn't a fully formed plan. It was a dark impulse looking for an excuse. He looked around. The street was quiet. He was a detective. He had authority. He walked over to the car. He ran a hand along its cool, flawless flank. He peered inside at the perfect leather, the glowing instruments. A terrible, jealous want mixed with his rage. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, universal tool he sometimes used. He wasn't a thief. He wasn't. This was different. With a glance at the diner window, he worked quickly, clumsily. The door lock on such a car was a complex thing, but the window was another matter. He found a slim edge, and with a muffled crack that sounded terribly loud in the quiet night, the window slid down an inch. His heart was hammering now, but it felt like excitement, not fear. He reached in, popped the latch, and opened the door. The interior light came on, bathing him in a soft, accusing glow. He slid into the driver's seat. The seat hugged him, but it felt wrong. The smell was new leather and clean technology. He put his hands on the steering wheel. It was small, perfect. He could say he saw something. A suspicious package. A fugitive. He was securing the vehicle. It was his duty. The story built itself in his head as he fumbled for the ignition. There was no key, just a button. He pressed it. The engine woke up. It wasn't a roar. It was a deep, vibrating hum that came up through the seat, a sound of immense power held perfectly in check. He put the car in drive. It crept forward, silent as a ghost. He pulled away from the curb, leaving the diner, the prosecutor, and every last bit of his good sense behind. The city streets streamed past the pristine windshield. He pushed the accelerator just a little. The car responded with a surge that pressed him back into the seat. A wild, giddy feeling replaced the anger. This was power. Real power. Not the messy, complicated power of badges and favors, but pure, simple, mechanical power. He was in control. Of this, at least. He pointed the car toward the coastal highway, the one with the long, sweeping curves overlooking the dark water. The streetlights became a blur. He pushed harder. The hum became a snarl. He took a curve, the tires gripping with a ferocity he'd never felt. For a moment, he was not a disgraced detective. He was a king. The next curve was sharper. He saw it too late. He turned the wheel, but his drunk, heavy hands turned it too much. The car, so responsive, obeyed instantly. It swung wide, the tires screaming in protest, losing their perfect grip on the cold asphalt. The detective's eyes went wide, the triumph evaporating into pure animal panic. He slammed the brakes, which only made things worse. The world spun. The glowing dashboard became a whirl of light. There was a terrible grinding shriek of metal and carbon fiber meeting something that would not yield. The sound of his own shout was lost in the cacophony of the crash. Then silence, broken only by the hiss of steam and the tink, tink, tink of cooling, dying metal. He was alive. He was unhurt. The airbag had bloomed in his face and was now deflating like a sad, white balloon. The windshield was a spiderweb of cracks. The beautiful, sculpted front of the Aston Martin was wrapped around a concrete pylon that marked the edge of the scenic overlook dot. The fog in his mind was gone, blown away by adrenaline and terror. He smelled gasoline, oil, and burnt electronics. He fumbled for the door handle, shoved the crumpled door open, and stumbled out onto the gravel. He looked back at the wreck. It was no longer a symbol of anything. It was just a broken, very expensive thing. And he had broken it. He heard a car approaching in the distance. Without another thought, he turned and ran, scrambling up the embankment and into the dark woods, leaving the king's chariot in ruins behind him. The first thing the prosecutor felt was a cold, hollow surprise. He stood on the damp sidewalk outside the diner, his empty hand still holding the ghost of a car door handle. He'd been inside for 20 minutes, maybe 25. He'd eaten a piece of pie and gone over the notes for the next day's meeting with the state police commissioner. His mind had been full of strategies and legal precedents. Now it was blank, wiped clean by the empty space where his car had been. For a full minute, he just stood there. He looked up the street, then down. He checked the numbers on the parking meters, wondering if he had somehow walked out of the wrong door. But no, there was the cracked pavement he'd stepped over. There was the flickering neon sign of the donut shop next door. His car was gone. A slow, simmering anger began to heat the cold surprise inside him. This wasn't just theft. This was a targeted insult. The car was impossible to miss, impossible to mistake. Someone had seen it, wanted it, and taken it. In this part of the city, at this hour, it felt like a slap in the face. He pulled out his phone, his movements stiff and precise, and called the police. The 2 uniformed officers who arrived were polite, but he could see the look in their eyes as he described the vehicle. An Aston Martin Valkyrie. One of them actually whistled, low and soft. They took the report, but their demeanor was of men documenting a tragedy that was already over. They talked about chop shops, about professional crews that could spirit a car like that across state lines in under an hour. They promised to check traffic cameras, but their tone said not to hope for much. The prosecutor thanked them, his voice flat. He called a taxi to take him home. In the back of the cab, staring at the blur of the city, the anger hardened into something else, resolve. This wasn't just a personal violation. It was a challenge. If they could take something so visible, so clearly his, with impunity, what did that say about the city he was supposed to help fix? He felt a shift inside, a locking into place. This was now a case. And he was very, very good at cases. The next morning, he walked into the district attorney's office early. The story had already spread. He saw the glances, the poorly hidden curiosity. His boss, the district attorney, a weary-eyed man who had been in Lake Haven politics for 30 years, called him in. Hell of a thing, the district attorney said, stirring his coffee. Terrible. I've got a guy who can help with the insurance, knows the exotic car market. Thank you, the prosecutor said. But I'd like to call the state police, today. The district attorney looked up. Our guys already have the report. With respect, the prosecutor said, his voice calm and even. The car was taken from a block away from the police precinct. It's a highly distinctive vehicle worth over $2 million. The likelihood this was a random crime of opportunity is near zero. This feels deliberate. Given my role here, reviewing certain police activities, it creates a conflict of interest for the local department. It needs an outside view. The district attorney studied him. He saw the cold fire in the younger man's eyes, the same fire that had made him request this prosecutor for the dirty job. He sighed, knowing where this would lead, knowing the storm it would kick up. But he also knew he couldn't say no. It was the right legal call. Make the call, he said. Meanwhile, across the street, the detective walked into the precinct, looking like he'd been in a fight. His eyes were raw and red, his skin pale. He hadn't slept at all. He'd walked for miles in the dark, his mind racing in panicked circles, before finally calling his wife to pick him up from a gas station, spinning a story about his car breaking down and his phone dying. The smell of the crash-burnt metal, spilled fluid seemed to cling to his clothes. The buzz in the precinct was all about the stolen supercar. He heard the words like blows. They were talking about traffic cameras, forensic teams, state police involvement. His stomach turned to ice. He'd been so drunk, so furious, so stupid. He'd thought only of the insult, of the momentary power. He hadn't thought at all. He went to the locker room and splashed water on his face. In the mirror, he saw a frightened man. He tried to rebuild the wall inside, the one made of badge and bluster. It was an accident, he told himself. Asterisk, a mistake. I wasn't myself. Asterisk. He was a detective. He knew how investigations worked. He could get ahead of this. He found his younger partner at his desk. Heard about the circus across the street? The detective asked, forcing a grin that felt like a crack in his face. Somebody took the new guy's rocket ship. Serves him right, flashing it around here. The partner just nodded, not looking up from his computer. State police are coming in, I heard. The detective's heart thudded. State? For a stolen car? That's overkill. It's the value, I guess, the partner said, finally looking at him. His eyes were careful, neutral. You look rough. You okay? Long night, the detective grunted, and walked away before his partner could ask any more questions. By noon, the state police investigators were there. They were different from the local cops. Quieter, with less laughter. They moved through the precinct to set up a temporary office, their presence a silent accusation. The detective felt their eyes on him, on everyone. He made a show of being busy, of being annoyed by the disruption. The break came faster than anyone expected. That afternoon, one of the state police detectives, a serious woman with her hair in a tight bun, came to see the prosecutor. She had a laptop. She played a video from a city traffic camera a block from the diner. The quality was grainy, the night dark, but the car was unmistakable as it pulled away from the curb. The figure getting into it was a bulky shape in a dark leather jacket. "Can't make a face," the state police detective said. "But look at the walk. That's not a kid. That's a big man. He moves like he's comfortable, not hurried." The prosecutor watched the figure slide into his car with a terrible familiarity. "He knew how to get in," he said quietly. Then a second piece. A call came from the tow yard where the wrecked Valkyrie had been recovered from the coastal highway. An officer had found something while doing a preliminary sweep of the crash site, something that had fallen into the weeds near the pylon. It was a laminated card on a broken clip, a parking pass for the Lake Haven Police Department precinct lot. The side with the license plate number was smeared with mud and grass, but the logo and the precinct number were clear. The state police detective brought this news to the prosecutor, her face grim. "It could have been dropped by anyone at any time," she cautioned. "It's a public road, but it's a connection." The prosecutor held the plastic card in a clear evidence bag. It was cheap every day. It was the most damning thing he had ever seen. He thought of the crumpled warrant request on his desk. He thought of the resentful eyes he'd felt on him from across the street. "I want to see the duty roster for last night," he said, his voice like stone. "For everyone in the narcotics unit." The net was closing, and the detective felt it. When he heard the state police had the parking pass, a cold sweat broke out on his back. He remembered the clip on his sun visor. He must have hit his head on it during the crash. He felt a rising tide of panic. He needed a story. A good one. He decided to get ahead of it. He went to his lieutenant, a man he'd known for 15 years. He looked ashamed, which wasn't hard. "Lieutenant," he said, closing the office door, "I think I messed up bad." He spun his tale. He'd been at the last call, had too much to drink. He'd left, disoriented. He'd seen the fancy car. The door was just slightly ajar. He couldn't bring himself to say he'd broken in. He'd had a crazy, drunken idea to just sit in it, to see what it felt like. One thing led to another. He'd started it, and then, terrified of getting a DUI right there, he'd panicked. He'd driven it away, meaning to just park it somewhere safe, but he'd lost control on the coastal road. He'd run because he was scared, ashamed of what he'd done. He poured it all out, playing the humiliated veteran, the good cop who made one terrible, drunken mistake. He emphasized the shame, the accident. He begged for help, for internal discipline, for anything but the state police. The lieutenant listened, his face growing longer and heavier with every word. When the detective finished, the lieutenant sighed, a sound of profound disappointment. A drunk and disorderly? Taking a car? For God's sake. He rubbed his temples. The state guys already have the parking pass. Your story? It might work for the taking. But the crash, the fleeing, it's bad. You'll have to tell them. Today. And you're suspended. Right now. Give me your badge and gun. The detective's hands trembled as he handed over the symbols of his life. The weight of their absence was immediate and terrifying. The lieutenant's phone rang. He answered, his eyes fixed on the detective. Yes, he's right here. He held out the phone. It's for you. It's the state police investigator. The detective took the phone. The voice on the other end was polite, professional, and utterly cold. Detective, we'd appreciate it if you could come down to our temporary office to answer a few questions about last night. We can do it here, or formally at our field office. Your choice." He looked at his lieutenant, who just shook his head, staring out the window. The walls of his castle, he realized, were not just cracking. They had already fallen, and he was standing in the ruins. "I'll come down," he said, his voice hollow. The room they put him in wasn't the usual interrogation room with the two-way mirror. It was a small conference room in the precinct, but it didn't feel like his house anymore. The state police detective sat across from him. She had a folder and a quiet way of listening that made the silence feel heavy. The detective, now without his badge, started with his story. The drunk and confused mistake. The panic. He poured it out, adding layers of shame, of a career flashing before his eyes. He was just a man who had a bad night, who made a terrible error in judgment. The state police detective listened, her hands folded on the folder. When he finished, she didn't speak right away. She just looked at him for a moment. "You walked from the crash site back toward the city," she said finally. "That's several miles. In the dark. You didn't call anyone for a ride?" "I was disoriented," he said. "Ashamed." "You were seen on a residential security camera about 2 miles from the crash at 2:17 a.m., she said, her voice flat. "You were walking at a steady pace. You didn't look disoriented. You looked like a man walking home." His mouth went dry. He hadn't known about the camera. "Let's talk about the car," she continued, opening the folder. She slid a photograph toward him. It was a close-up of the driver's side door handle. "There are fresh micro-scratches here, consistent with the tool being used to pry the window down. You said the door was ajar." It might have been locked. "I might have fumbled with it," he stammered, the story already starting to fray at the edges. "And the parking pass," she said, placing the evidence bag on the table. The plastic card looked pathetic under the fluorescent lights. "Yours went missing from your personal vehicle's visor last night, according to your wife, whom we spoke to an hour ago. She confirmed you always kept it there." He felt a hot surge of betrayal, mixed with fear. They had talked to his wife. They were in his home. "It must have fallen out earlier," he managed to say. "Weeks ago. It was found lodged in the wreckage, under a bent piece of trim," the detective said, not raising her voice. "Forensics suggests it was inside the car during the impact, not outside on the road." The walls of the room felt like they were moving closer. His story, built on the shaky foundation of a drunkard's excuse, was collapsing under the weight of simple facts. The detective across from him wasn't yelling. She was just connecting dots, and the picture she was drawing was of a liar. "Where did you have dinner last night?" she asked, shifting suddenly. The diner. Mike's place." He said the first name that came to mind, a place he hadn't been to in years. She made a note. "And you paid with?" "Cash." "He always said cash. She nodded, closing the folder. "Okay, we'll need your clothes from last night. The leather jacket, especially, for fiber analysis against the driver's seat." He felt the last bit of color drain from his face. The jacket. He'd shoved it in the back of his closet, reeking of smoke and fear. They would find it. They would match it. "I want a lawyer," he said, the words bursting out of him. "Of course," the state police detective said, standing up. "That's always your right. Interview is terminated at 4:12 p.m. She left the room, leaving him alone with the hum of the lights and the crushing certainty of what was coming. Asterisk, 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 across the street. The prosecutor was not celebrating. He sat in his office, the wrecked parking pass in its bag on his desk. He felt no thrill of the hunt. Instead, he felt a cold, grim understanding. This wasn't about a car. The detective's clumsy, angry crime was a window thrown open into a much darker room. With the local detective now officially a suspect and suspended, the prosecutor moved without any hesitation. He called his small team into his office. "We're expanding the scope," he told them. His voice was calm, but it had a cutting edge. "Pull every case file for the last 5 years, where this detective was the arresting officer or the primary evidence custodian. Focus on cash seizures, asset forfeitures. I want to see the chain of custody for every gram of drugs, every dollar of cash, in every one of his cases." His team, a mix of curious and wary, got to work. The prosecutor himself dived into the files. He worked through the night, the city lights blinking outside his window. The pattern emerged slowly, then all at once. It was in the paperwork, a story told in sloppy initials and contradictory timestamps. He found a case where $40,000 in cash was seized from a dealer's apartment. The evidence log showed it was checked into the property room by the detective at 11 p.m., but the security log for the property room showed he didn't swipe his access card until 1:15 a.m., a 2-hour gap. He found another where small, valuable jewelry taken from a suspect was listed as hold for investigation and never reappeared on any inventory list. The suspect, a scared woman with a long record, had dropped her complaint after a private meeting with the detective. Found a pattern of informants who had serious charges disappear from the docket right before they gave key testimony for the detectives. Cases, favors, the currency of his kingdom. Detective's story of a one-time drunken mistake was like a cheap curtain hiding a rotting wall. The prosecutor was now determined to tear the whole wall down. The next day, the search warrant was executed. State police officers went to the detective's home. His wife stood in the kitchen, her face pale with a mixture of fear and anger, as they took his computer, his files from a home office, and the leather jacket from the back of the closet. They also took financial records. In his locker at the precinct, they found a small, greasy notebook. It wasn't a detailed ledger of crimes. It was something almost sadder. It was a list of favors. Initials, dollar amounts with plus or minus signs, dates going back years. $200 to LS for info on warehouse. Fixed ticket for C's. Nephew, J owes me 1 for dropped possession. It was the map of his shadow system. The prosecutor pored over the notebook when it was brought to him. It was written in a lazy, confident scrawl. This was a man who never thought he would have to explain himself, who thought his word, his badge, was the only law that mattered on his beat. The final blow came from the financials. The detective's salary was decent for a public servant, but not extraordinary. Yet his personal bank statements showed regular cash deposits, always under $10,000, the amount that triggers a bank's reporting requirement. They were spaced out, inconsistent with his paychecks. There was also a boat loan, payments made in cashier's checks. A vacation to a resort his salary could not comfortably afford. The prosecutor laid it all out in a new file on his desk. It was no longer a file about a stolen car. It was titled Official Misconduct, Theft, and Perjury. He called the state police detective. "We're not just looking at grand theft auto and leaving the scene," he said. "We're looking at a pattern of corruption. The car was just the symptom. The anger that made him do it, that came from a system he built. A system where he was the judge. We're going to charge him with that system." The detective on the other end of the line was quiet for a moment. "It's bigger than I thought," she said. "It always is," the prosecutor replied. He looked out the window at the precinct across the street. It looked smaller now. He thought of his car, a beautiful, broken machine. He thought of the detective, who had broken so much more than metal and carbon fiber. He had broken a sacred trust. And for that, the prosecutor knew the law had to answer with more. than just a slap on the wrist for a joyride. The detective was now formally charged with grand theft, destruction of property, and falsifying records. He was released on bail, but he was a ghost in his own life. He couldn't go to work. Old friends on the force avoided his calls. The local news had the story, and while they didn't name him yet, the whispers were everywhere. A detective is suspected. He sat in his living room, the silence of the house screaming at him. His wife had taken the kids to her mother's. He looked at his hands. They were the hands that had broken into a car, that had taken cash from evidence bags, that had shaken hands on dirty deals. He had told himself he was keeping the city safe. Now, he was just a man waiting for the walls to finally crush him, knowing that the man who was bringing them down wasn't doing it for revenge over a car. He was doing it because the rules mattered. And the detective, for the first time in 22 years, was completely out of favors. The courtroom was not the grand wood-paneled hall you see in movies. It was a modern, fluorescent-lit box with warm carpet and a faint smell of lemon cleaner and old worry. But the air was just as heavy. Every seat was filled. Cops in plain clothes, reporters with sharpened pencils, city officials with blank faces, and curious citizens all packed the benches. They were there to see a spectacle, a detective on trial. The detective sat at the defense table with his lawyer, a man known for getting tough cases reduced to plea deals. The detective wore his one good suit, but it hung on him now. He had lost weight. His face, once ruddy and confident, was pale and thin. He kept his eyes on the grain of the wooden table, tracing the lines as if they were a map out of this room. The prosecutor sat at the other table. He looked calm, orderly. A legal pad was squared in front of him, a single pen beside it. He did not look at the detective. He looked at the jury. 12 ordinary people from the city. A teacher, a mechanic, a retired nurse. They were the ones he needed to understand. The trial began not with the crash, but with the system. The prosecution's first witnesses were not about the car. They were about the notebook, the bank deposits, the missing evidence. A forensic accountant took the stand and laid out the numbers, the cash deposits that didn't match the salary, the vacations, the boat payments. It was dry, complicated stuff, but the jury listened intently. They were being shown a secret life. Then came the witnesses from the detective's past. A nervous man, now working as a forklift driver, who had been arrested on a drug charge years ago. He testified that the detective had taken a gold chain from him during the arrest. He said it was off the books for his informant, the man said, his voice shaky. Said if I complained, the charge would get worse. The chain never appeared on any evidence form. A woman, her hands trembling, told how after her son's arrest, the detective had offered to make things go away if she paid him $5,000 in cash. She had paid. The charges were dropped. She had been too afraid to speak up until now. The defense lawyer did his job. He attacked their credibility. He pointed out their criminal records, their reasons to lie. He painted the detective as a tough cop who made enemies, who now was being betrayed by the very lowlifes he'd put away. Some in the jury listened, their faces thoughtful. Then, the prosecution called the detective's younger partner from the narcotics unit. The courtroom went still. The partner walked in, clean-shaven, in a stiff suit. He wouldn't look at the detective. He swore to tell the truth, his voice low. The prosecutor approached him gently. Did you ever see the defendant take anything that wasn't properly logged as evidence? The partner swallowed. I saw him. Handle things, money, jewelry. He'd say it was for an informant, but there was never a receipt. Did you ever question him about it? A long pause. Once, early on. He told me to keep my head down and my mouth shut if I wanted to have a long career in this city. He said the rules were different here. That we had to be practical. The defense lawyer exploded in objection, calling it hearsay, but the damage was done. The jury had heard it. The code of silence had been broken from the inside. Finally, after days of building this picture of a man who thought he was above the rules, the prosecution turned to the night of the car. The state police detective who led the investigation took the stand. She methodically laid out the evidence, the security camera footage of the bulky figure, the tool marks on the car, the parking pass found in the wreck, the security camera showing him walking calmly away from the crash. She saved the most damning piece for last. The detective's own words. She played the audio from his initial interview in the conference room, where he told his story of a drunken mistake, the door being ajar, his panic. Then she played the recording of his call to his wife from the gas station made right after the crash. His voice on that call was clear, sober, and deliberate as he told her his own car had broken down. No slur, no panic. Just a lie. The two stories didn't match. The jury could see it. The man on the stand had not been a disoriented drunk. He had been a calculating liar. The defense's case was short. They called a few character witnesses old colleagues who spoke of his bravery, his arrests. They tried to frame the whole thing as a witch hunt, a good cop being crucified for one mad night, fueled by a new prosecutor with a fancy car and a grudge. The defense lawyer pointed a finger at the prosecutor, calling him an outsider who didn't understand the messy work of keeping the city safe. Then it was the prosecutor's turn for the final argument. He didn't yell. He didn't pace. He walked slowly to the jury box and stood before them, his hands at his sides. This trial, he began, was never about a car. He let the words hang in the quiet room. A car can be replaced. This trial is about a badge. That symbol, he said, nodding toward the detective, that badge is a promise. A promise that the person wearing it will protect the law, not prey on the people they're sworn to serve. He walked them through it again, simply. The cash, the missing evidence, the threats. He built a shadow system, the prosecutor said, where he was the judge, where favors were money and justice was for sale. He didn't see citizens. He saw targets and opportunities. For years. Then he turned to the night in question. And when that system was challenged, when a warrant was denied because it wasn't clean, because it didn't follow the rules he despised, what did he do? He saw the symbol of that challenge. A car belonging to the man who represented the rules. And in a fit of rage, he decided to break it. He didn't steal it for a joyride. He took it to destroy it, to prove that in his city, his anger was more powerful than the law. The prosecutor looked at each juror. This wasn't a mistake. It was the final, logical act of a man who had forgotten what the badge meant. He didn't wreck a car. He wrecked the public's trust. And if you let that go, if you call it a bad night, then you tell every person in this city that the promise doesn't matter, that the badge is just a piece of metal that lets you take what you want. He finished softly, but every word carried. Hold him accountable, not for the metal and the glass. Hold him accountable for the promise he broke. The defense lawyer gave a fiery rebuttal, talking about grace, about context, about a career of service undone by one error. But the energy had shifted. The jury's eyes were no longer on the lawyer. They were on the detective, who sat perfectly still, his head finally bowed, not in strategy, but in what looked like a terrible, final understanding that the judge gave the instructions. The jury filed out. The waiting began. It didn't take long. Just 4 hours. The buzz in the hallway died instantly when the court officer said the jury had reached a verdict. Back in the box of a courtroom, the foreman, the retired nurse, stood. Her hands were steady. The judge asked for the verdict. on the count of grand theft auto. Guilty, on the count of felony destruction of property. Guilty, on the count of official misconduct. Guilty, on the count of filing a false report. Guilty. The words fell like stones, each one landing with a final heavy thud. The detective did not move. He just closed his eyes. The lawyer beside him put a hand on his shoulder, then began gathering papers. The prosecutor did not smile. He nodded once, slowly, to the jury. Then he looked at the detective. For the first time since the diner, their eyes met. There was no triumph in the prosecutor's gaze. There was only a cold, clear certainty. The law had spoken. The system, the real one, had worked. The judge set a date for sentencing. As the court officers came to lead the detective away, the room erupted in a low murmur. The show was over. But for the man in the ill-fitting suit, walking slowly toward the side door with his hands now held awkwardly, as if he didn't know what to do with them without handcuffs, the real weight was just beginning to settle. He was no longer a detective. He was a convicted felon, and the walls he had always believed would protect him had become the walls of his new world. The sentencing hearing was a short, brutal affair. There was no more drama to be had. The evidence had been presented. The verdict was in. Now it was just about the math of justice. The detective stood before the judge wearing a county jail jumpsuit. He had lost more weight. His face was a closed door. His lawyer made a final plea for mercy, talking about his long service, his family, the one-time nature of the crime. He called it a fall from grace. The judge, a stern woman with glasses perched on the end of her nose, listened patiently. Then she spoke. "This was not a fall from grace," she said, her voice clear and cutting. "That implies an accident. This was a deliberate leap from a position of power. You weren't a citizen who stole a car. You were a sworn officer who used his authority to commit a theft, then lied to cover it up. But the car is almost incidental. The greater crime is the betrayal. You treated your badge as a license to steal, to intimidate, and to ignore the very laws you swore to uphold. You have poisoned the well of public trust, and that poison takes years to clean." She looked down at him, not with anger, but with a kind of cold disappointment that was worse. The sentence on all counts, to be served concurrently in a state correctional facility, is not less than 5 years, and not more than 10. The detective's knees almost buckled. 5 years, minimum. He had hoped for county time, maybe a year, maybe 2 with good behavior. This was real prison. A decade of his life gone. The finality of it hit him like a physical blow. He was led out of the courtroom, his footsteps echoing in a new kind of silence. The transfer happened quickly. The orange jumpsuit was exchanged for a coarse, state-issued blue one. He was put on a bus with bars on the windows, rumbling away from the city he knew every corner of, toward a complex of concrete and wire he had never seen. Riverview State Penitentiary wasn't a violent movie set. It was loud, ugly, and monotonous. The clanging of metal doors was a constant soundtrack. The air smelled of bleach, stale food, and unwashed men. He was processed, given a number, and assigned to a cell with another man, a gaunt-faced guy doing time for burglary, who barely glanced at him. The first night was the longest of his life. Lying on a thin bunk, listening to the coughs, shouts, and murmurs of 100 other men, the reality pressed down on him. He was nobody here. His badge, his reputation, his network of favors, all of it was worthless. He was just a number in blue. The fear was a constant hum in his chest. This was his life now. The routine, the boredom, the loss of every single choice, from what to eat to when to turn off the light. Back in Lake Haven, life moved on, but it was changed. The prosecutor did not throw a party. He felt a quiet, grim satisfaction, but it was edged with tiredness. He had done his job. He had removed a corrupt officer, and in the process had sent a shockwave through the narcotics unit. 3 other officers were now under investigation. The culture was shifting slowly, painfully. He had sold the wrecked Valkyrie for parts. The money went into savings. He bought a sensible, unremarkable sedan. He drove it to work, parked it in the same spot, and no one looked at it twice. He preferred it that way. One afternoon, about 6 months after the sentencing, he was working late. The cleaning crew was in the hallways. His phone buzzed a message from an old colleague in the state capitol. It was a job offer. A bigger office, a more prestigious title, a chance to work on state-level policy. It was a clear step up, a reward for the messy, successful work he'd done in Lake Haven. He looked out the window at the city. The rain was sheeting down, washing the streets clean. He thought about it. He had come, he had seen the corruption, and he had broken its back in one sharp case. The offer was tempting. A cleaner fight. But then he looked at the files still on his desk. Follow-ups on the other officers. New cases coming in from cops who are now, maybe, a little less brave about bending the rules. The work wasn't done. It was just beginning. If he left now, it might all slide back. The city didn't need a crusader who came and went. It needed someone to do the dull daily work of building something better. He typed a reply. Thank you for the offer. I'm honored. But my work here isn't finished. He hit send and felt a surprising sense of peace. He turned back to the file on his desk dot at Riverview. The detective was learning the slow, hard lessons of his new world. He kept his head down. He worked in the laundry, the hot, steamy room where everyone was equal in their misery. He ate the bland food. He said, "Yes, sir," to the guards. The hardest part wasn't the fear or the boredom. It was the silence. No one called. His wife had filed for divorce. His old friends from the force were ghosts. The only person who visited him once was his younger partner. The meeting was awkward, through thick glass, talking on scratchy phones. "How's it going out there?" The detective asked, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. "It's different," the partner said. "Cleaner, quieter. They installed new cameras in the evidence room." He didn't say it was better. He just said it was different. The detective nodded. There was nothing else to say. The partner never came back. One day, in the prison library, a trustee handed him a booklet. It was for a GED tutoring program. He could become a tutor. He almost laughed. Him teach? But he took the booklet. He had nothing but time. The first time he sat with a younger inmate, struggling with fractions, something strange happened. He had to explain the logic of it, the step-by-step process. There was no bullying here, no shortcut, no favor to trade. Just right and wrong answers. The kid looked at him with empty eyes, not seeing a detective, not seeing a convict, just seeing a guy who might help him pass a test dot. It was the first thing he'd done in years that wasn't about taking, or lying, or covering up. It was about building a tiny, insignificant piece of knowledge in someone else's mind. It felt clean. He wasn't redeemed. He wasn't a good man suddenly. He was just a tired man in a blue uniform, teaching math in a room that smelled of old paper and despair. But for an hour a day, he wasn't thinking about the car or the badge or the terrible crash of his own making. He was thinking about numerators and denominators. The two men, the prosecutor and the detective, were now living in worlds that could not be more different. One in the muted light of an office, the other in the harsh glare of a prison block. One building a career on principle, the other serving a sentence born of ignoring all principles. But in their own ways, they were both surrounded by walls. The prosecutors were made of case files and duty, a cage of his own choosing. The detectives were made of concrete and steel, a cage he had built with every bad decision. The city of Lake Haven, under the rain, kept turning. It didn't care about either of them as men. It only cared about the system. The system had corrected a major flaw. It had removed a corrupted part. It was functioning coldly and perfectly, and in that there was a kind of bleak justice. The detective had believed the rules were for other people. Now he lived in a place where the rules were everything, where every minute of his day was dictated by them. The prosecutor had believed in the rules above all else. Now he was bound by them, working within their strict confines day after day. One was in a prison of walls and wire, the other in a prison of obligation and law. Both, in the end, were serving their time.